Okay, I'm going to be more or less using the same pieces they've provided with this pattern, but after making it up to my size, which is a size 10, it was still quite big around the bust area, so we did another mock-up in which Mum took it all in for me and remarked it. And also there was too much room under the arms, so we had to raise that up a bit. Apart from that, we've not done too much drastic alteration to the other pieces. The back's more or less the same as how they came with the pattern, but it was just the front that was causing too much of an issue. I'm going to be using this really nice satin brocade that I used on my movie animated Cinderella dress from SY Fabrics in America, and I'll show you the link to it in a minute. Unfortunately they don't ship internationally, which is a bit of a pain, but luckily I have a nice friend, Nancy, if you're listening, who shipped it for me. The fabric I'm using for the outer fabric is from syfabrics.com, and I bought it in this colour, hot pink, lot 2 medium rose brocade. Once you've cut all your pieces of your outer fabric, I've then gone and cut out the same pieces using this calico as a stiffener, or you can use canvas fabric as well. And basically I just pinned the two together from the top to the bottom, smoothing it out to make sure that you don't get any excess or too much wrinkling in your outer fabric. And then I've tacked the two together using a tacking stitch a couple of centimetres in from the edge, and I've done that to every single piece. Okay, now all my pieces could be treated as one. I've pinned them together as you would any other bodice, just to make sure that everything's fitting right. This is going to be my liner. Yes, I know it's not a corresponding colour before you say anything, but me forgot to get some from the fabric shop, so I'm having a lazy moment and this is all I could find in my cupboard, so I'm going to use this as a lining, but I'm not too bothered because when it's all sewn up you won't see any of the top anyway, because the collar will be hiding all the edges along the top, and the bottom is going to be turned under anyway, so, and then the edges, so it won't really matter too much. But before I even go ahead and sew anything on the outer bodice, at this stage I just want to make sure that all my lining pieces add up with the outer bodice before anything's sewn together properly, so I can just doubly make sure, and as this is the stage to really do it at, because once you've sewn it, it's a lot to unpick. Not fun. So now I've done that and everything seems to match up well, I'll go into the next step. Okay, what I want to do is pipe the front seam and the two seams on the left and right of the centre seam, so basically the front three middle bits. So you want to buy some bias binding which looks like this, but in the colour that corresponds with the colour of your bodice, or close enough. This has been ironed out. You'll also then need some piping cord. This is if you're going to use your method of making your own piping. It's best to buy on the bias because then it will allow to bend round the corners when you come to pipe it. If you cut fabric on the straight grain, it will be a lot harder to try and manipulate it round the curves of the bust line. So if you don't have bias, you can make it out of fabric, but you would need to cut your strips on the diagonal. When you come to measure how much piping we're going to need, we'll start with the front centre seam here. don't cut your piping or your bias as long as the bodice edges. You want to leave an overlap of a couple of centimetres, at the top there, and you want to cut it a couple of centimetres below this point, so about there, just to allow yourself a bit extra at this stage. And you do the same on the other seams as well, or if you're planning on piping the back, you do exactly the same. Once you've put your piping foot on and put your piping in, you want to leave a little bit of cord sticking out the top, and you want to line up a hole on your piping foot, leaving a slight gap so you don't end up sewing over your piping. You want to encase the piping between the layers, so you want to very carefully sew down just to the right of the piping cord by a millimetre. And this is my finished piping strip. Okay, next you want to start inserting your piping. So what I'm going to do is I've started pinning this on. I don't need to pin the strip all the way down, but make sure that your piping cord on, say, this particular section is facing inwards and you've got raw edge to raw edge, like so. I've already done the centre one. I've pinned that and I've sewed the sewing line, and I've sewn over the same line where I did initially put the piping in. Okay, next we're going to start with the centre front seam and put the two together, and hopefully when it opens up you'll have a nice row of piping like that. You can use the piping foot again, except this time you want to get as close as you possibly can to the piping cord without obviously sewing through the piping cord itself. Okay, the piping is now in. And the front three seams. And I've sewn the rest of the bodice together as normal. And I've clipped back the excess on this stiffener fabric, as you can see, and I've done that on all the seams. And the next thing to do is on the curves of the bust is to clip your corners. Careful not to go through the sewing line. This is my sleeve pattern. I've used the same pink fabric that I used on the peplum. Okay, next run an ease gathering stitch at the top of the sleeve from these points shown. You want to sew up the side seam on the sleeve and then iron your seams flat. Right, we're just setting our sleeves in. Just to point out that an ease stitch is different from a gathering stitch, because a gathering stitch is where you gather heavily and you pull to create a gather to create ruffles. An ease stitch is just gently pulling on the thread just to pull the fabric in a little bit, just so it helps it go around the corner, otherwise you'll have a lot of problems. We're just going to show you the first stage of putting the sleeve in. First of all, make sure your sleeve is the right way out.
Then place the armhole over the sleeve, like so. And the first thing you have to do is line up your side seam of your bodice with the seam of your sleeve. and pin those together as close as possible. Making sure that you pin any seams flat, ready for sewing. Starting from the bottom edge, put your edges together and pin as you go. I'm going to do about 3 inches, about 6 or 7 centimeters. Then you start going the opposite way, lining up your sleeve. Like so. Whenever you come to a seam that's been ironed down flat, you make sure that it is flat when you put the two together. Like so. Follow the edge on the inside, then on that side you make sure that you pin your seams down flat. Now I'm going to show you how to do your ease stitching. Go up to about halfway up the sleeve and with the flat end of a pin grab hold of the thread and just pull it through a little bit so you can grab hold of it. And then you're going to pull on that thread as if you're gathering a seam, like so. You can go as far as you like. So now we have all our gathers down one end. Then what we need to do is try and get rid of as many of those ruffles as we possibly can, but just leave a little bit of give in your sewing thread, and then go on to the next one. Pull out the gathers a little bit, just leave a little bit.
It might take you 2 or 3 attempts to adjust the stitches in your ease stitch to get it right, so you don't have too much bulk or excess, but you get the general idea that you're just pulling the fabric in a little bit to manipulate it round the curve. It should look something like that. Then the next thing we'll need to do is actually sew it in properly. Okay, now that the sleeve's been put in and turned up at the bottom and hemmed up, we're just going to leave this for now, because what we want to do is work on the collar piece, which we're going to do as a separate item. This is the practice run, and it'll have a centre front seam, 2 side seams, and then a seam at the back, and I plan on piping all the way around the top to make it look nice. So before we put our liner on, I'm going to make up the collar, and we will be putting some Velcro strips on so that this will be held in place with some Velcro and just attaches onto the edge of the bodice, so that when I start dancing and move my arms around, hopefully it should help hold the collar in place, so that when my arm goes up, just saying, and it comes back down, it should, after doing this trial run, fall back in place quite easily.